On the 21st of September 2001, there was a knock on my uncle's door in the capital city of Eritrea, Asmara. It was still early in the morning, and my uncle was still in bed with his wife, who was 7 months pregnant, and their 2-year-old baby who was sleeping peacefully next to them. He got up to open the door and came back a few minutes later to tell his wife that some policemen wanted to speak to him, that he was going to be back later that afternoon. 17 years later, my uncle has still not come home. My name is Vanessa Tsehaye. I'm an Eritrean who was born and raised in Sweden, and 5 years ago, I decided to start campaigning for my uncle, Seyoum Tsehaye's release. And it wasn't until then that I realized that my uncle's imprisonment was about so much more than just him. You see, 2001 was a crucial point in Eritrea's history. And its importance came from a promise that had been made by the leaders who liberated the country 10 years earlier. When the guerrilla group EPLF won the 30-year-long war of independence from Ethiopia, the group became a political party, the PFDJ, and the guerrilla leader became the president. Isaias Afwerki became the president. The war had been fought on the premise of a search for democracy, justice, and equality, but there were no elections. Eritreans were promised that the lack of democracy only was temporary. The new government needed time to establish democracy, and so the people gave them time. This temporary period was supposed to end in 2001. It'd been 10 years since independence, and the brutal war with Ethiopia had finally ended. The first elections were finally scheduled to happen. But tensions were in the air. There was a clear understanding amongst everyone involved that the events of 2001 was going to set the blueprint for the newly established nation. And this led all interested parties to fight hard for their vision of Eritrea to become reality. My uncle was a known, fearless, and vocal man. Even during the War for Independence, he was challenging the leadership, and he was even imprisoned for a whole year for going around speaking too much about democracy while working as a teacher in the guerrilla camps during the war. During the war, he was also a prominent and brilliant photographer and documentary maker, and his work was known all around the world. After independence, he became the director of the national television channel, Eritrea. But because he continued to challenge the leadership, he was demoted from that very powerful position to a less powerful position in the Ministry of Tourism. Eventually, Seyoum quit and became a freelance journalist focusing on the well-being of the Eritrean people. And as the government's policies became more and more authoritarian, his reporting intensified. When students protesting new policies that violated their human rights in April of 2001 were detained and even killed in prison, my uncle wrote that the leaders of today are killing the leaders of the future. He urged the government to have an open dialogue with the people to ensure the best result for the future. At the same time, a group of 15 politicians and high-ranking military personnel published an open letter to the president, criticizing the fact that no election preparations seemed to be being made for the election that was scheduled to happen later that year. They called his regime illegal and unconstitutional. They were warned not to continue, but they did, and they did so loudly. They spoke to local and international media, and the issue grew bigger. And then finally, on the 18th of September 2001, when the entire world's eyes were riveted on New York and the terrorist attacks that had happened only a week earlier, the government took that opportunity and imprisoned 10 journalists, including my uncle, and 11 politicians who had been a part of the public outcry for democracy. They shut down all free press, and the press has not been opened since then. Until this day, no one's been charged, prosecuted, or been given an official reason for their imprisonment. Until this day, the only information that we have about our relatives' conditions and whereabouts are from prison guards who have fled the prisons. They say that they're held in a maximum security prison in the middle of the desert, where it's burning hot during the day and freezing cold during the night, and with their hands and legs tied like this 24 hours per day. Until this day, no one has been allowed to visit them, and no one has been released. Since then, Eritrea has been governed without a constitution, parliament, and any elections. And it's turned into one of the most censored countries in the entire world. It is the only country in Africa without any independent media at all. There's barely any access to the internet. Only 2% of all households have access to the internet, and even then, it's heavily surveilled by the government. There's no civic society whatsoever. The only university in the country has been shut down, And there's not a single person in the country that publicly can criticize the government. Any sign of opposition is met with intimidation, imprisonment, or death. And this intimidation reaches all the way to the diaspora. When my uncle was warned about the risks of his work, he replied, "If we don't give them a voice, no one will." And he was right. Imprisoning my uncle and his colleagues was a part of a wider plan by the Eritrean president to gain ultimate control over the Eritrean people. A shutdown of the press is a shutdown of democracy as a whole. And that is why that week in September of 2001 has been referred to as the week Eritrea officially became a dictatorship. By silencing the people who already were speaking up against their crimes, shutting down institutions that would encourage and facilitate dialogue and debate, and creating an environment where the price to speak up is your life, the Eritrean government is free to do whatever it wants without any criticism. Today, the Eritrean people is suffering immensely. In a country of only 5 million people, there are over 300 prisons where thousands of people are held without any trial for any reason that you can imagine. The conditions and torture in these prisons are beyond anyone's imagination. And in 2015, a United Nations Commission accused Eritrea for committing crimes against humanity for the crimes that they're committing in these prisons. There is no religious freedom, there's no freedom of association, there's no freedom of movement. Eritreans don't have the right to leave the country unless they are granted an exit visa, permission from the government. And these permissions are rarely given because they want them to stay in the country. But the biggest victims of this dictatorship is the youth population. Aforkis Eritrea is robbing the youth from their future. Young people are forced to spend their last year of high school in military service. After this, they have to serve in a mandatory national service program. The problem isn't that Eritrea has a national service or military service per se. A lot of countries have the same programs. The problem is the brutal treatment of these workers and the fact that it goes on indefinitely. Once you're enrolled, you don't ever leave. The 2015 UN report likened this program to slavery. Not only are the people in the national service program being extremely maltreated and abused, but the potential that they could have developed and used to contribute to their country and the world is being completely wasted. Youth are forced to choose between a life in Eritrea with no future or a life on flight where they encounter unimaginable horrors, traumatizing and even killing them. Over 5,000 people flee every month, choosing to rather risk dying on flight than stay as slaves. The leaders of today are killing the leaders of the future, just like my uncle warned in 2001. I was born and raised in Sweden, very far away from my uncle in Eritrea. But despite the great distance between us, my mom made sure that my uncle's story, her brother's story, was always very present in my life. When I started high school, I decided it was time for me to take action on his behalf. I was frustrated by the silence around my uncle's case and about my country in general. And I realized that I was part of the problem. I was 16 years old. I was old enough to take on the responsibility. And for 3 years, I've been a part of a very active Amnesty International group, which meant that I had some campaigning skills. I also lived in a country where the right to protest and speak up was at my very disposal. I had no excuse to remain silent. On the anniversary of his arrest in 2013, I launched the organization One Day Seyoum with a mission to put my uncle's name back on the map. We started off with an internet campaign with a video and petition, and created an advocacy group at 3 different high schools in Sweden. Our launch was profiled on the front page of Sweden's biggest newspaper, and quickly the word started spreading. Since then, we've continued to loudly advocate on behalf of my uncle and his colleagues who were imprisoned alongside him. We've used political and legal advocacy, international campaigns, video series, and ambassadors at schools and universities all around the world to raise awareness about human rights abuses in Eritrea. One Day Seyoum is motivated by my uncle's strong commitment to democracy, accountability, and the freedom of expression. Seyoum recognized the power of words, and we're simply using his own tactics to free him. We do everything in our power to make sure that my uncle and his colleagues are not forgotten. And at the same time, we share the stories of the Eritrean people that my uncle and his colleagues would have shared if they were free and here today. The same stories that the president and the government are trying to hide. I raised my voice because the price not to is too high. My country is held hostage, we're risking at seeing a lost generation, and the world is completely silent. I raised my voice because that silence is sustaining the power of the regime. I raised my voice because it is my duty. I am an Eritrean who was lucky enough to be born outside of the country. That luck and that distance does not erase my responsibility for my people. It amplifies it. And I raise my voice because it is what my uncle taught me to do. If I don't do it, if we don't do it, then who will? Many of us are lucky. We have the tools to speak up and protest. We have no excuse to remain silent. We have to use that luck, that power, to speak up for the people of Eritrea, regardless of how long it's going to take for change to come. Because the fact that it's going to be a long journey cannot deter us. No dictatorship has ever lasted forever, but they do last longer if they're left unchallenged. I will dedicate the rest of my life, if I have to see the day that not only my uncle finally can come home, but that the Eritrea that he fought for and that he's been fighting for 17 years, where all Eritreans truly are free, finally becomes reality. And I urge every single one of you to join me in whatever way that you can. Thank you very much.